Blood ran in the streets of Bodie, California, on a scale that made even hardened frontier lawmen blanch, with an average of one homicide per week during the town's deadliest years. Between 1877 and 1881, this remote mining camp, 8,000 feet up in the eastern Sierra Nevada, earned a reputation so fearsome that a young girl heading there with her family reportedly wrote in her diary, "Goodbye, God, I'm going to Bodie." What transformed this collection of canvas tents and wooden shacks into the most statistically violent settlement in the entire American West, surpassing even Tombstone and Dodge City in per capita bloodshed. The violence didn't emerge from nowhere. Gold strikes in 1859 brought the first wave of prospectors to the barren hills near Mono Lake. But the real catalyst came almost 2 decades later when the Standard Company hit a massive ore body in 1876, pulling out rocks so rich in gold that news spread like wildfire through California and Nevada. Within 18 months, Bodie exploded from a struggling camp of perhaps 200 souls to a roaring city of nearly 10,000. The buildings spreading across the sagebrush flats so quickly that lumber couldn't arrive fast enough. Men slept in shifts, sharing bunks in boarding houses where the sheets never cooled. The winter of 1878 saw temperatures plunge to 20 below zero, winds howling down from the peaks with such ferocity that pedestrians tied ropes between buildings to avoid getting lost in blizzards on Main Street. Yet still they came, drawn by reports of miners earning $4 a day in the shafts, of gamblers winning thousands in single hands, of opportunities that would never come again. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand what really happened on the American frontier, beyond the sanitized myths and Hollywood fantasies, hit subscribe now, because we're diving into primary sources, coroner's reports, and eyewitness accounts that reveal how violence becomes institutional in a place where traditional authority has yet to arrive. The men pouring into Bodie brought more than pickaxes and dreams. The majority were young, unmarried, and accustomed to settling disputes with fists or firearms. Census records from 1880 show that males outnumbered females nearly 3 to 1, and among men aged 18 to 35, the ratio climbed to 6 to 1. These weren't farmers bringing families to cultivate land across generations. They were hard rock miners, many with experience in the brutal camps of Nevada's Comstock Lode, men who'd witnessed cave-ins and crushing accidents, who drank to forget the darkness of the underground shafts and the certainty that gold fever would fade. Saloons outnumbered churches by a margin that shocked even sympathetic observers. The Reverend F.M. Warrington, arriving to establish a Methodist congregation in 1878, counted 65 saloons operating openly on a single street, many running gambling operations in back rooms where faro, poker, and monte separated miners from their wages with mathematical efficiency. Violence in Bodie followed patterns that reveal much about frontier society's fault lines. Newspaper accounts from the Bodie Standard and the Daily Free Press, meticulously archived despite multiple fires that consumed portions of the town, show that the majority of killings stemmed from disputes over mining claims, gambling debts, and personal insults magnified by alcohol. But beneath these immediate triggers lay deeper structural causes. The town existed in a legal gray zone perched on the border between California and Nevada territories, with county law enforcement stationed more than 100 miles away across mountain passes that became impassable for months each winter. When a man was wronged, he couldn't rely on distant courts or cavalry units. He relied on himself and on the weapons that virtually every adult male carried as routinely as a pocket watch. Consider the case of Thomas Treloar, a Cornish miner who arrived in Bodie in September 1877 with experience from the tin mines of England. On the night of January 14, 1878, Treloar entered the Bon Ton Saloon after his shift ended at the Bodie mine, his clothes still dusty from the underground work, his hands scarred from handling drilling equipment in narrow passages lit only by candle flame. He'd been drinking for perhaps an hour when a gambler named Joseph DeRoche accused him of bumping the faro table during a hand worth nearly $80. Witnesses later testified that words escalated rapidly, voices rising above the piano music and the constant noise of boots on wooden floors. DeRoche stood from his chair. Treloar's hand moved toward his coat. What happened in the next 3 seconds left DeRoche, bleeding out on the saloon floor from a gunshot wound to the abdomen, dying before a doctor could arrive from his home 2 streets away. The legal response illuminates everything. Treloar surrendered to a deputy constable, spent one night in a makeshift jail, and was released on bond posted by fellow Cornish miners who controlled significant claims in the district. When his case finally reached trial 4 months later, The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of justifiable homicide on grounds of self-defense. DeRoche, the prosecution established, had been known to carry a Derringer, though whether he'd reached for it remained disputed. The ambiguity didn't matter. In Bodie's moral economy, the man who drew first often lived, and the community accepted this calculus as a necessary adaptation to circumstances where formal law couldn't protect citizens in the critical seconds when violence erupted. But Treloar's case was merely typical. The truly revelatory pattern emerges when examining multiple killings across seasons and social classes. Between November 1877 and March 1881, a period of just over 3 years, coroner's records document at least 64 violent deaths in Bodie, though historians believe the actual number exceeds 70 when accounting for incomplete records and bodies discovered in remote claims after spring thaws. This translates to a homicide rate of approximately 116 per 100,000 residents annually, assuming an average population of 7,000 during those years. By comparison, Dodge City during its wildest period from 1876 to 1885 recorded roughly 45 killings in a decade, yielding a rate closer to 65 per 100,000. Tombstone, immortalized by the gunfight at the OK Corral, saw its violence concentrated in brief episodes rather than sustained across years. What made Bodie different? The answer lies in the intersection of economic volatility and ethnic tension. The mines operated on boom and bust cycles tied to ore quality and eastern commodity prices. When the Standard Company's production peaked in 1880, pulling out nearly $400,000 in gold in a single quarter, employment ran high and optimism fueled tolerance. But when shafts hit barren rock or water flooded lower levels, layoffs rippled through the community. Men with no wages grew desperate. Claim jumping increased. The saloons which extended credit during good times called in debts. Every contraction triggered a wave of violence as the social fabric frayed under economic pressure. Ethnic divisions amplified these tensions into lethal confrontations. Bodie's population included significant numbers of Irish, Cornish, Chinese, Mexican, and native-born American workers, each group clustering in distinct neighborhoods and occupying different rungs on the labor hierarchy. The Cornish, with their expertise in deep shaft mining, commanded premium wages and supervisory positions. The Chinese, numbering perhaps 300 at the community's peak, worked mainly in service industries operating laundries, restaurants, and wood delivery operations. They faced systematic discrimination that occasionally exploded into violence. On the night of July 4, 1879, a mob of intoxicated revelers stormed through Bodie's Chinatown district, setting fire to wooden structures and assaulting residents who fled into the darkness. One Chinese man, identified in records only as Ah Tai, died from injuries sustained when he was thrown from a second-story window. No arrests followed. The Daily Free Press editorial the next day condemned the violence in abstract terms, but noted that the Celestials should expect rough treatment if they competed with white labor. The mechanisms of law enforcement, or rather their inadequacy, created a vacuum that vigilante justice rushed to fill. Bodie's official law enforcement for most of its violent period consisted of a single constable and perhaps 2 deputies, men elected by popular vote and paid through fines and fees rather than regular salaries. They lacked jail facilities beyond a small wooden structure that prisoners routinely escaped by kicking through walls. When arrests did occur, trials faced months of delay as circuit court judges traveled between distant county seats. This gap between crime and consequence meant that informal systems of justice emerged, operated by the mining companies and business owners who had the most to lose from chaos. The most telling example came in January 1881, when a gambler and sometime gunman named Joseph DeWitt shot and killed a popular mine foreman named Thomas McDonald during an argument outside the miners' union hall. The circumstances were murky. Some witnesses claimed McDonald had been unarmed. Others insisted he'd reached for a weapon. DeWitt fled immediately, heading north toward Nevada on horseback through snow that had been falling for 3 days. Within hours, a group of approximately 20 men, identified in newspaper accounts as leading citizens, organized a pursuit. They caught DeWitt 30 miles from town, exhausted and half frozen. What happened next reveals the brutal pragmatism of frontier justice rather than returning him for trial. The pursuers held an impromptu court session in an abandoned line shack, heard testimony from those present, and voted on DeWitt's fate. 15 voted for hanging. They carried out the sentence using a rope thrown over a roof beam, leaving DeWitt's body frozen in the snow for the county coroner to collect 2 weeks later. The shocking detail isn't the lynching itself, tragic as it was, but the community response, no prosecution followed. The Bodie Standard, while noting the irregular nature of the proceedings, concluded that swift justice serves as a deterrent where legal justice cannot reach. Several of the men involved held positions of civic responsibility. One served on the school board. Another operated the largest mercantile in town. They returned to their businesses and families, their actions tacitly endorsed by a population that saw vigilante execution as a necessary evil in the absence of functioning courts. Yet even as violence peaked, countervailing forces began to emerge. Women, though vastly outnumbered, organized reform efforts that targeted the saloon culture and pushed for institutions that might civilize the camp. The Methodist and Catholic churches, established by 1879, created social spaces where families gathered and behavioral norms could be reinforced. The Miners' Union, formed in 1878 to negotiate wages and safety conditions, provided a structure for dispute resolution that occasionally prevented conflicts from escalating to gunplay. Most significantly, the very success that fueled Bodie's growth began to attract a different class of settler, people with capital and long-term interests who needed stability to protect investments. The transition didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't linear, but examination of death records shows a notable shift starting in late 1881. Homicide rates began declining even as population remained relatively stable. Several factors converged. The ore bodies that had seemed inexhaustible started showing signs of depletion. Production numbers from the Standard and other major mines dropped by nearly 40% between 1881 and 1883. As the bonanza faded, the most violent and transient element of the population moved on, chasing new strikes in Arizona and Montana. Those who remained had committed to Bodie as a long-term home rather than a temporary hunting ground. Improved law enforcement also played a role, though perhaps less than civic boosters later claimed. The county finally stationed a sheriff's deputy permanently in Bodie in 1882, backed by a budget for a proper jail constructed of iron-reinforced brick. More importantly, the mining companies began hiring private guards and implementing workplace rules that reduced the everyday carrying of weapons underground and in company facilities. When men couldn't settle disputes with immediate violence, they were forced toward negotiation and occasionally actual legal proceedings. The Chinese community's experience offers a particularly revealing lens on how violence became institutionalized and eventually challenged. Through the late 1870s, attacks on Chinese residents occurred with grim regularity, rarely investigated and almost never prosecuted. But in 1883, a Chinese merchant named Ah Ling, who operated a successful store on Main Street and had lived in Bodie for 6 years, pressed charges against 3 men who'd robbed his establishment and assaulted his nephew. In an earlier period, such a complaint would have been dismissed or ignored. Instead, the newly empowered sheriff's office arrested the suspects, and a jury remarkably convicted 2 of them. The sentences were light, merely 60 days and a small fine, but the precedent mattered. It signaled that violence against ethnic minorities might finally carry consequences, a small crack in the edifice of impunity that had characterized Bodie's early years. By 1885, Bodie had entered unmistakable decline. Population dropped below 3,000. Many buildings stood empty, their windows broken by winter winds, their interiors stripped of valuable fixtures by departing residents. The violence that had defined the town's identity receded not because of moral reformation or effective policing, but because the economic engine that had brought thousands of young men into close proximity simply sputtered out. Gold production, which had peaked at over $3 million in 1880, fell to less than $300,000 by 1887. The Standard Company, the behemoth that started it all, ceased operations in 1888, its shafts flooding, its equipment auctioned off piece by piece. Yet Bodie's legacy extends far beyond its brief, bloody zenith. The town became a case study for legislators and reformers grappling with how to extend effective governance to rapidly developing frontier regions. California's expansion of county-level law enforcement in the 1880s, including improved salaries for sheriffs and the construction of regional jails, drew directly from lessons learned in places like Bodie, where the absence of institutional authority had enabled sustained violence. The experience also influenced debates about statehood for territories, with proponents arguing that full state status and its accompanying legal infrastructure prevented communities from descending into the kind of chaos that had characterized Bodie's early years. For historians, Bodie offers invaluable insights precisely because its violence was so well documented. Unlike many frontier towns where records burned or were never kept, Bodie's newspapers, court files, and coroner's reports survived in remarkable detail, now preserved at the Bancroft Library and other archives. These sources reveal patterns that complicate romantic notions of the Old West. The violence wasn't primarily about cowboys and outlaws or noble lawmen taming a wild frontier. It was about economic desperation, ethnic hatred, masculine honor culture, and the simple absence of mechanisms to resolve disputes without bloodshed. Most men who killed in Bodie weren't professional gunfighters or career criminals. They were laborers and merchants who, in the heat of argument, in the fog of alcohol, with weapons readily available and legal consequences distant or non-existent, made decisions that ended lives and scarred communities. Modern Bodie stands as a ghost town preserved in a state of arrested decay by California state parks. Visitors walking its dusty streets can peer through windows into saloons where glasses still sit on bars, into homes where furniture remains positioned as if occupants merely stepped out briefly. The physical preservation is remarkable, but the real haunting is conceptual. Bodie forces us to confront what happens when human society outpaces human institutions, when economic opportunity draws thousands to a place before the social structures that enable peaceful coexistence can develop. The mining camp wasn't an aberration or a unique product of frontier conditions. It was an extreme example of dynamics that appear whenever rapid development, resource competition, and demographic imbalance converge. Whether in California gold camps, Alaskan oil towns, or contemporary boom cities rising overnight in developing nations. The most violent town in the Old West holds up a mirror to the perpetual tension between the human capacity for both aspiration and destruction, and asks whether we've truly learned to build societies that can contain the latter while nurturing the former.